Don Quixote, written by Miguel de Cervantes, is a cornerstone of world literature, blending humor, satire, and profound human insight. It tells the tale of a deluded nobleman who dreams of reviving the chivalric code, only to clash repeatedly with the harsh realities of the world. In 17th-century Spain, chivalric romances were fading, leaving a void for Cervantes to fill with satire. The story explores the tension between idealism and reality through Don Quixote, a well-meaning yet misguided dreamer, and his pragmatic companion, Sancho Panza. Together they embark on absurd adventures that reveal human folly, the dangers of blind idealism, and the value of friendship. With this in mind, let us now embark on Don Quixote's whimsical yet poignant adventure, a journey where dreams and reality collide in the most unexpected and comical ways. In the quiet plains of La Mancha, a nobleman named Alonso Quijano becomes obsessed with the chivalric tales that dominate his library. These stories, filled with gallant knights, virtuous ladies, and heroic quests, ignite a deep yearning in him to restore the lost age of knighthood. With his imagination running wild, he rebrands himself as Don Quixote de la Mancha, the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. Clad in an old, rusty suit of armor and wielding an ancient lance, he mounts his bony horse, Rocinante, and sets off to right the world's wrongs. His journey, however, is destined to blur the lines between nobility and absurdity. The first quest, Dreams of Glory. Don Quixote's first foray into knighthood begins with unparalleled enthusiasm, fueled by his romanticized notions of valor and justice. He dons a battered suit of armor inherited from his great-grandfather, patches up a missing visor with makeshift materials, and declares his old underfed horse, Rocinante, the noblest steed in the land. With these humble tools and his head brimming with dreams of restoring chivalry, Don Quixote sets off, leaving his village behind. As night falls on his journey, Don Quixote comes across a modest roadside inn. In his deluded mind, the plain building transforms into a grand castle, its windows glowing like enchanted battlements. The innkeeper, an ordinary man with no aspirations beyond serving food and drink, is elevated in Don Quixote's eyes to the status of a noble lord. Without hesitation, Don Quixote approaches and demands lodging for the night, speaking in the archaic, flowery language of the knights from his beloved books. The innkeeper, amused by the peculiar guest, decides to humor him. Don Quixote insists on being knighted so he may embark on his heroic missions with official status. Sensing an opportunity for harmless fun, the innkeeper stages a mock ceremony in the courtyard. With a kitchen ladle as a ceremonial sword, and a couple of curious onlookers, serving maids and a stable boy, as witnesses, he dubs Don Quixote a knight. Overjoyed and oblivious to the jest, Don Quixote vows to repay this noble gesture by dedicating his life to the protection of the weak and the defense of virtue. Empowered by his newfound status, Don Quixote wastes no time seeking opportunities to prove his valor. On the road, he encounters a young shepherd boy tied to a tree, being beaten by his master over a dispute about wages. Enraged by this injustice, Don Quixote intervenes, declaring that such cruelty will not be tolerated in his presence. Drawing his lance, he commands the master to release the boy and pay him his rightful earnings. The frightened man agrees, promising to do as instructed. However, as soon as Don Quixote departs, confident in the success of his intervention, the master resumes the beating with even greater cruelty. The boy is left worse off than before, cursing the help of the delusional knight. This marks a recurring theme in Don Quixote's adventures. His good intentions often lead to unintended consequences, leaving those he seeks to help in a more dire situation. Later on, Don Quixote encounters a group of traveling merchants. Seizing the opportunity to display his chivalric devotion, he blocks their path and demands that they proclaim his beloved Dulcinea del Toboso, the entirely imaginary lady of his dreams, as the most beautiful woman in the world. The merchants, surprised by the bizarre request, initially try to humor him, but when Don Quixote insists that they must do so without even seeing her, one of them laughs and refuses. Don Quixote, enraged by this perceived insult to his lady's honor, charges at the group on Rocinante. However, his malnourished steed stumbles mid-charge, sending Don Quixote crashing to the ground in a heap of dust and dented armor. The merchants, seeing no real threat, leave him lying there, bruised and humiliated. Beaten but not broken, Don Quixote gathers himself and makes his way home. Despite the failures and ridicule he faced, his determination remains unshaken. In his mind, he is not Alonso Quijano, a middle-aged man from La Mancha, but Don Quixote, a knight-errant on the cusp of greatness. This first quest sets the tone for Don Quixote's adventures, a blend of comedy and tragedy, where noble ideals collide with the harshness of reality. While his actions often spiral into chaos, they reveal the purity of his intentions, a man so deeply devoted to the ideals of chivalry that he is blind to the absurdity of his quest. The second quest, a squire and the windmills. Having returned home battered but unbowed from his first quest, Don Quixote quickly begins planning his next adventure. Undeterred by his failures, he decides that no true knight-errant can journey alone. Every great knight needs a loyal squire, someone to carry supplies, offer counsel, and bear witness to his heroic deeds. With this in mind, he sets his sights on recruiting Sancho Panza, a simple yet practical farmer from the village. Sancho Panza is a man of modest ambitions, content with his life as a farmer but intrigued by the promise of something greater. Don Quixote approaches him with grand assurances. If Sancho serves faithfully as his squire, he will be richly rewarded with the governorship of an island conquered during their adventures. Though skeptical of such lofty promises, Sancho's curiosity and the allure of potential wealth and power prove irresistible. He agrees, albeit with some reluctance, to follow the self-proclaimed knight-errant into the unknown. Their partnership is one of stark contrasts. Don Quixote is idealistic, verbose, and oblivious to reality, while Sancho is pragmatic, plain-spoken, and deeply rooted in common sense. This dynamic becomes the heart of their journey, infusing their adventures with both humor and humanity. One of their earliest and most iconic adventures unfolds on the open plains. As they travel, Don Quixote spots a row of windmills on the horizon. To his mind, these are not mere windmills but fearsome giants, their massive arms spinning menacingly in the breeze. Sancho, ever the voice of reason, tries to explain that these are harmless wind-powered machines, but Don Quixote, blinded by his chivalric fantasies, refuses to listen. "Do not interfere with a knight's duty," he declares, lowering his lance. With a cry of battle, he charges at full speed toward the nearest windmill. Rocinante, his faithful but underfed steed, struggles to keep pace, and the inevitable happens. The rotating blades of the windmill catch Don Quixote and hurl him violently to the ground. Bruised and tangled in his own armor, Don Quixote insists that an enchanter has transformed the giants into windmills to thwart his noble mission. Sancho suppresses his laughter, helps his master back to his feet, and they continue on their way. The windmill episode marking the first of many such battles that blend comedy with tragedy. As their journey continues, Don Quixote's imagination transforms ordinary encounters into epic sagas. On one occasion, they cross paths with a barber carrying a simple brass basin used in his trade. To Don Quixote, however, this is no mundane object. It is the golden helmet of Mambrino, a legendary relic of immense power and prestige. Declaring the barber a knight unworthy of such a treasure, Don Quixote demands the helmet for himself. The startled barber, unwilling to argue with the armed and eccentric knight, flees, leaving the basin behind. Don Quixote triumphantly places it on his head, proclaiming it a fitting replacement for his broken visor. Sancho, stifling his doubts, praises his master's prize, though he privately wonders how anyone could mistake a basin for a helmet. Throughout their travels, Don Quixote remains devoted to his imagined lady love, Dulcinea del Toboso, a peasant woman he has never truly met. One day, as they pass through a village, Don Quixote spots a group of peasant girls riding on donkeys. To him, one of these women is unmistakably Dulcinea, disguised by enchantment to test his faith. Sancho, trying to manage the situation, awkwardly plays along, referring to the girl as Dulcinea. The confused peasant reacts with irritation, baffled by Don Quixote's poetic declarations of love and loyalty. Despite the girl's clear rejection, Don Quixote remains convinced that Dulcinea has been cursed by a rival enchanter. This episode deepens the pathos of Don Quixote's delusion. His inability to see reality reflects his profound longing for a world more noble and beautiful than the one he inhabits. Throughout these misadventures, Sancho Panza becomes both Don Quixote's steadfast companion and a voice of reason. Though he often sees the absurdity of his master's actions, Sancho grows to admire Don Quixote's unwavering commitment to his ideals. Sancho's earthy wit and practical wisdom frequently provide comic relief, but they also serve to ground the story, highlighting the contrast between Don Quixote's lofty dreams and the harsh realities they face. At times, Sancho himself begins to waver between skepticism and belief. The more he witnesses Don Quixote's unshakable faith, the more he starts to question his own understanding of the world. Could there be some truth to his master's vision, however distorted? This dynamic adds depth to their relationship, making them one of literature's most endearing pairs. This second quest sets the tone for Don Quixote and Sancho's journey. A series of encounters in which Don Quixote reinterprets mundane situations as epic battles or enchanted trials. From herding goats mistaken for enemy armies to simple townsfolk viewed as royalty in disguise, every moment becomes an opportunity for Don Quixote to prove his chivalric worth. Meanwhile, Sancho alternates between dutifully assisting his master and exasperatedly cleaning up the messes left in his wake. As they travel, Don Quixote and Sancho become both a source of entertainment and a cautionary tale for those they meet. Noblemen, peasants, and even priests cross their path, often engaging with them out of curiosity or mockery. Some attempt to reason with Don Quixote, but his unshakable faith in his chivalric ideals makes him impervious to logic. Sancho, meanwhile, provides a voice of earthy wisdom, tempering his master's lofty speeches with practical insights. Yet Sancho, too, is gradually influenced by Don Quixote's worldview. Despite recognizing the absurdity of his master's actions, he grows to admire the purity of Don Quixote's spirit. The two form a bond that transcends their differences, with Sancho's grounded nature balancing Don Quixote's flights of fancy. The final quest, defeat and reflection. As the years pass, Don Quixote's once glorious journey begins to take its toll. His body, once youthful and full of energy, is now weathered by the hardships of his many adventures. His armor is battered and rusted, his once noble steed Rocinante has grown weak and frail, and the wounds he has sustained from countless battles leave him in constant pain. But despite his physical decline, his spirit remains steadfast, clinging to the ideals of chivalry and the heroic vision he has crafted for himself. As Don Quixote's journey continues, his delusions become even more pronounced. He still roams the countryside, seeking out quests and battles that seem to exist only in his mind. His unshaken belief in his mission, however, begins to draw the attention of others. And so, it is that Don Quixote crosses paths with the Knight of the White Moon, a mysterious figure who challenges him to a duel. Unbeknownst to Don Quixote, the Knight of the White Moon is no ordinary adversary. This knight is actually a friend of his, the young bachelor Sansón Carrasco, who has seen the damage Don Quixote's delusions are doing and has decided to intervene. Sansón, understanding that the only way to end Don Quixote's reckless adventures is to defeat him in combat, disguises himself as the Knight of the White Moon and challenges Don Quixote to a duel. The two knights meet on a field, their lances raised in defiance. Don Quixote, filled with pride and righteousness, believes that this is yet another test of his valor, another foe he must overcome in the name of chivalry. But the duel quickly turns in favor of the Knight of the White Moon. Despite his tenacity and determination, Don Quixote is overpowered. In the end, he is defeated, thrown to the ground in a heap of bruised and battered flesh. As per the terms of the duel, Don Quixote is forced to accept the outcome. The Knight of the White Moon declares that, in order to regain his honor, Don Quixote must abandon his knightly pursuits and return home to La Mancha. The defeat is a crushing blow to Don Quixote's spirit. For the first time in his long journey, he is forced to confront the reality that his quest for glory may be nothing more than a misguided dream. Reluctantly, Don Quixote agrees to the terms. He mounts Rocinante, who is also weakened and defeated, and begins the long journey back to his village. Along the way, his spirit falters. The once clear vision of noble knights, virtuous ladies, and epic quests that fueled his every step now seems distant and intangible. His dreams of chivalry begin to crumble, and the weight of his failures presses heavily on him. When Don Quixote finally returns to his village, it is with a heavy heart and a broken spirit. He is no longer the proud knight-errant who once roamed the land with purpose and determination. He is a man defeated, stripped of his armor, his ideals, and his purpose. The villagers who once mocked him as a madman now see him in a new light, tired, vulnerable, and human. Back in his familiar surroundings, Don Quixote falls ill, his body succumbing to the years of wear and tear from his many adventures. In his feverish state, he is forced to reckon with the gap between the world he dreamed of and the one he lived in. He begins to question the very nature of his quest and the value of the ideals he once held so dear. Were his adventures merely the product of a deluded mind? Was his belief in chivalry a foolish fantasy that led only to pain and humiliation? As his illness deepens, Don Quixote comes to a profound realization. He is no longer Don Quixote, the knight-errant. He is Alonso Quijano, the humble nobleman he once was. The man who had dreamed of restoring the world to a golden age of knights and valor has finally accepted that his dreams were nothing more than illusions. In a final act of self-awareness, Don Quixote renounces his knightly persona. He acknowledges the folly of his adventures, admitting that the world he sought to create was never real, and that his devotion to chivalric ideals had led him astray. In his final days, surrounded by family and friends who have witnessed his long, strange journey, Don Quixote comes to terms with his own humanity. He is no longer the deluded knight, but a man who has lived and dreamed with passion, who sought meaning in a world that often made no sense. With this acceptance, he dies peacefully, his heart at rest. Though Don Quixote passes away, his story lives on as a testament to the power of imagination, the fragility of dreams, and the complexity of human nature. In the end, his journey, though filled with folly and failure, becomes a journey of self-discovery. Don Quixote's tragic flaw was his inability to separate his lofty ideals from the harsh reality of the world around him. But in his final moments, he finds peace in the acceptance of who he truly is. His legacy endures as one of the most enduring and beloved characters in literature, a man whose heart was filled with noble intentions, even as his mind was clouded by delusion. The story of Don Quixote is not just a comic tale of absurd adventures, but a profound exploration of the human condition, a reminder that sometimes, even in our most misguided quests, we learn the most about who we are. The character of Don Quixote, with his undying idealism and his clash with reality, embodies the complexities of human nature. He is both a tragic figure and a heroic one, a man who dreams grandly but ultimately succumbs to the limitations of the world. Through his eyes, we see the power of dreams and the folly of pursuing them without understanding the realities that shape our lives. Sancho Panza, as the voice of reason, complements Don Quixote's character by reminding us of the importance of practicality and common sense. Together, they form a perfect contrast, the dreamer and the realist, the visionary and the grounded. This dynamic provides a powerful lesson about the necessity of balancing idealism with reality, and how both elements are integral to navigating life. Ultimately, Don Quixote offers readers a timeless lesson that while our dreams and ideals give us purpose, we must also have the wisdom to confront reality. It is through this delicate balance that we can live meaningful lives, striving for greatness yet acknowledging the world around us, and embracing both the fantasy and the reality of being human.